Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Climate and Water Update webinar for summer 2018-19. For those joining us for the first time, welcome. And for anyone who joined us for our webinars before, welcome back. Today we'll be discussing recent climate conditions over winter, also the summer 2018-19 outlooks for temperature, rainfall and stream flow. So let's begin. My name is Claire Mullen and I'll be delighted to be your moderator today. Caroline is our producer and will help moderate your questions. Hi Caroline.
Hi Claire, how are you going?
Good. Please send us all your questions today through the chat function and we will address as many as we can. Before we start, may I ask for your attention as we cover off some housekeeping items. Our broadcast today will run for 60 minutes with plenty of time allotted for questions. This webinar is also being recorded and the video will be shared with you via email. For first-time webinar attendees, please see some helpful tips on your screen. Please note the chat box where you can send through any questions or feedback for the presenter. Please send us your questions during the session and we will answer as many as we can. The conversation isn't just confined to the webinar, we welcome interaction on LinkedIn as well. So don't forget to include #BOMWebinars in your posts. And finally, I am delighted to introduce you to our presenters today, Catherine Ganter and Jonathan Pollock. Hi Catherine, hi Jonathan.
Hi Claire.
Morning Claire.
How are you? Catherine and Jonathan both work in the climate prediction team at the Bureau. Their experience lies particularly in seasonal outlooks and climate. Collectively, they have 20 years of experience in climate. Catherine's main focus is reporting on and communicating the current state of the main climate drivers for Australia, as well as the monthly and seasonal rainfall and temperature outlooks. Jonathan joined the Bureau as a weather observer, collecting and recording meteorological data for climate forecasting and aviation purposes. Later, he moved into climate information services, turning data into useful information for agricultural emergency services and general public users. We also have Fatima Mechanic in the room with us. Hi Fatima.
Hi Claire.
She's one of our streamflow experts and she will be answering your streamflow questions via the chat function. Thanks for helping out, Fatima. So welcome everyone. Catherine, would you like to tell us what we'll be hearing about today?
Sure thing, Claire. So the overview for today is we'll begin with a quick look at spring 2018 conditions. Then we'll move on to the climate outlook and the drivers behind it, the water outlook, so stream flows, and then how this will affect our severe weather type indices such as heat waves, bushfire risk and tropical cyclones. So we'll start up with a poll just to get an idea of what sector everyone's from.
So we'd like you to fill in your poll. It should have popped up on your screen right now. You tell us where you're from. Answer A is government, B is agriculture, C is water management, D is emergency services, E is energy and F is everybody else. So if you're an F person, please tell us in the chat function where you're from. I hear it was a sticky night in Darwin overnight, is it true?
Yeah, the overnight low was 29.9.
Sounds pretty hot and sweaty, hey?
Yeah.
That's right, even for Darwin. Yeah.
And we had a bit of rainfall in Queensland overnight.
Yeah, there was some good falls in Queensland, in between Bundaberg and Rockhampton. There was a lot of sites that had more than 50 millimetres in the last 24 hours.
Interesting. Well, thank you for the rain. If everyone can have a go at the poll, we have more than 100 people online, so we'd like to keep it going for a couple of minutes just to find out where you're from. Hopefully it's popped up on your screen and you can select your answer. If you don't qualify for government, agriculture, water, emergency or energy, let us know through the chat function where you're from. And I'd like to hear from our listeners too through the chat function. Has it been a good year for you weather-wise or not? What are the standout features for you two weather-wise? Can I ask, Catherine or Jonathan, your favourite weather moments this year?
Well, I think what's been going on in the Pacific has been really fascinating this year, where we sort of started out sort of coming out of a La Nina, and then we've sort of swung around to, we've had this El Nino on the cards for quite a while now. So it's interesting watching that evolve.
That hasn't quite locked in.
That's right, yeah. We're still waiting for it to become a full-blown event. Yeah.
Is it different to this time last year?
Well, yes, that's right. This time last year we were coming into a La Nina. We declared La Nina in December last year.
So we're up the dry end.
That's right. We're almost at the opposite place where we were this time last year.
Okay, so it definitely is a different year. Catherine, do you have a favourite weather moment this year?
Actually, I'll be discussing some of them shortly, so I'll be cheeky and keep them for a short while later.
Just one would do.
Oh. I think we'll be moving on from the polling, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, I think we will move on.
We'll get the results out to you when we can.
So if we take a look at recent conditions for spring, first up we have spring rainfall here, with blues indicating above average rainfall and reds indicating below average rainfall. Spring's been a season of contrast, with the 3 spring months varying quite a bit. Although overall it was near average in parts of the east and dry in southern parts. Tasmania was 8th driest on record and Victoria 9th driest in 119 years. Some of this dry was likely due to the positive Indian Ocean Dipole, or IOD, that was in place during spring. So just for a quick reminder on the positive Indian Ocean Dipole, it's a little bit like El Nino in the Pacific. So we have warmer waters in the Western Indian Ocean and cooler waters near us in the east. And this pattern draws moisture away from Australia, typically bringing dry conditions to southern and central Australia. So some of this signal we saw in the south was likely due to positive IOD. So just to illustrate the contrast seen in spring, here are the individual 3 months. September, you can see there on the left, was actually our driest September on record, while our October and November generally fared much better. We can see some good falls occurred in parts of New South Wales and inland Queensland. And this has meant that rainfall has improved short-term rainfall deficiencies. We can see this by comparing the addition of November to one of our current drought monitoring periods. So I've just looked at the short one starting in April this year. The pinky red colours on the maps here show the bottom 10% of rainfall records, and there is a noticeable decrease in parts of New South Wales and southern Queensland. However, we still need an extended period of above average rainfall to remove these longer term rainfall deficits. So you'll probably notice by this point I've really only focused on the rainfall aspect of drought. There are different definitions of drought, and we report on meteorological drought, which is rainfall only, as in the Bureau only reports on meteorological drought. So we can take a look at how much rainfall we need in December to lift our 2018 annual total simply out of the bottom 10% of records. So that's what this map shows here on the right. And the totals for many areas, particularly inland, are at least double their December average. So that's simply to get 2018 out of the bottom 10%. So it has really been a dry year.
It has. We had 2 comments from our listeners before. Conditions across central and western Queensland have been terrible again, little rain, hot and dry. And Jay from Victoria was saying, I was happy when the rain hit, now we're having a series of 35-degree days. So here comes summer, right?
Yeah, and I'll get to some of the Queensland conditions shortly. So other forms of drought include hydrological drought, and that just basically looks at water in the natural system. So things like water storages, soil moisture, and stream flows. So for storages in the east, many have seen large drops over the past year, and that's including that in South Australia. So this pink line here is what it was last year, and then the blue is where we are currently. So we can see the past 2 years for Victoria haven't been great, and the New South Wales coast has seen storages just steadily decline over the last 2 years. Also, the Murray-Darling Basin here, which I've included there separately on the right, that's basically where the largest focus of our drought has been over the past year or so, has seen a large fall as a result of 2 poor years of rain. And that looks like it's of the order of about a 20% decrease in storages across the region. So what about soil moisture? Spring overall had below average soil moisture for many of the agricultural regions, including the Murray-Darling Basin. We did see some increase over the individual spring months, with the October and November rainfall over parts of the east helping that a little bit. In terms of spring maximum temperatures, nationally we had an 11th warmest spring on record, and that's 109 years. So the map here shows orangey yellows as above average and blues as below average. The focus of the heat was up north in the spring, as you can see on this map, with Queensland clocking in at 5th warmest. And if you're wondering how year-to-date is tracking, January to November days were 2nd warmest on record. So if we look at minimum temperatures for spring, there were warmer nights for many areas, particularly parts of the east, while southern mainland areas, so mainland's the big continental bit, were average to below average. And part of this was that the mainland southeast had some very cold nights in September, with nights below 0 in parts of the grain-growing regions of not only Victoria and South Australia, but also southwest WA. And the frost damage actually led to crops being cut for hay in a number of areas in northern Victoria and eastern South Australia. We saw summer-like warmth arrive earlier than usual in spring. So I see a question asking, can you define on record? So in terms of rainfall records, we're looking at 109 years. So the rainfall records start in 1900, but our temperature records start in 1910, so 10 years less. So it's over 100 years, regardless of the indice. So Canberra kicked off November with a 34.2 on the 1st of November, so that was quite early, while Melbourne hit 35.8 on the 7th of November. I felt that one. And Birdsville hit 44.3 on the 4th of November. Oof. Oh, imagine what summer's going to be like for them. So, as we foreshadowed, the end of November brought an extreme heat wave to northern Queensland, and this was focused along the tropical coastline. Numerous locations set monthly and some even annual daily high temperature records, and setting an annual record at this time of year is a bit odd. This map here on the right is gridded data, so it may differ just slightly from the stations, but at least one station, Cairns, beat its previous November record by over 5 degrees. And that's over a 100-year record there too. So a special climate statement is expected to be released sometime next week on this topic if you're wanting to get your stat on. So with this extraordinary heat at the end of November and a warm and dry spring, these all contributed to exceptional fire weather over eastern Queensland and a number of significant fires. So this here's a satellite image of the fires there. So you can see all the streaks of where the fires are. So I actually have an animation here, so I'm really hoping this works. And this animation's over a 2-hour period. So let's see how this goes. So the spread of these bushfires along the coast was something like 650 kilometres, which is basically the length of Melbourne to Sydney, if you try to imagine that sort of region. And
that's like 1,000 kilometres, right?
Yeah, it's 650. So the distance from Melbourne to Sydney is about 700 and something.
Wow.
So I can't seem to play this too well on a loop, but I played a few times. So, and the other thing is that this is rainforest that's burning, which is very unusual. Okay.
Thank you, and our users say they can see the animation. It's pretty shocking to watch, actually. It's a very large area, right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. We are going to take another poll, and we will take any questions that you have for us during this time as well. We will start the second poll. The question is, what information do you most need to make decisions this summer? There are 6 choices. A is recent conditions, B is temperature outlook, C is rainfall outlook, D is stream flow information, E is none, it's my break time, and F is other. We have, do you have any other questions for us, Caroline, coming through your chat session? No? No others? So what do you think might be the most popular answer? Catherine or Jonathan?
Well, I think most people would be interested in the rainfall. Me, I'm interested in the temperature.
I'm actually one of those in the rainfall camp. I've got quite a few veggies growing, so I'm hoping that they'll get a bit of rain in the summer.
I think we're all looking forward to a bit of a break as well, but definitely temperatures over the summer. Kelsey's telling us she's looking for a bit of everything leading to bushfire risk, and I think that's coming up, Kelsey. I can't tell you the answer now, but Jonathan will be covering it for you. Let's check. Caroline, do you have any other questions coming through your chat function? Oh, not today. We might close off that poll and see how we're going. Jonathan, I think you're going next for the next part of the talk, yes? So you're telling us about climate outlooks and its effects, yeah?
That's right, what we might expect in the month and season ahead and the reasons behind that. So on this first slide, we're looking at the outlook for summer from December through to February. And you can see 3 maps there. The one on the left-hand side is for maximum temperatures, the middle one is for minimum temperatures, and the one on the right is for rainfall. So if we have a look at maximum temperatures first, well, you can see that both the temperature maps have a very similar pattern, that most of Australia is covered in a very dark red shading there. And what that means is that for most of the country, there's a very high chance that we're going to have warmer than usual daytime and nighttime temperatures. You'll see there are some parts of Australia that don't have that dark red shading, the coast of WA and a lot of the coast around South Australia and even parts of Victoria. The shading there tends more to sort of the beige or white tones in the middle. And in those parts, you've got a roughly sort of 50-50 chance of a warmer or cooler than usual season. But really, they're quite emphatic that most of Australia is quite likely for it to be a warm summer.
A long, hot summer. And the rainfall?
The rainfall outlook, the map on the right, what that shows is that there's large parts of northern Australia that are likely to have a drier than usual summer this year. The strongest odds for drier than normal conditions are over northwestern WA, but you can also see that most of Queensland has those drier orangey brown shades, as well as parts of the top end and other parts of the territory. However, most of southern Australia and central Australia in that map has the lighter, the white sort of beige tones, and in those areas, it's roughly equal chance whether or not we'll have a wetter or drier season. But you'll notice on that map that there's no parts that have the sort of the blue, green-blue tones, which would suggest above average rainfall. So probably what that means is it's unlikely we're going to receive a widespread above average rainfall before autumn next year.
Hot, dry summer, huh?
Now this next slide is showing the rainfall outlook for the months coming up. So not the 3-month period of summer, just the 1 month of December and January. And you can see that in the December map, the one on the left-hand side, it has that similar pattern to the seasonal outlook for Western Australia, where large parts of the west and north have very low chance of getting above average rainfall. So we can flip that around and say they've got a high chance of getting below average rainfall if it's easier. But you'll notice that the pattern in Queensland for December is not as extensive as the seasonal pattern. It's really that the drier outlook is confined to some smaller areas. The January rainfall map, the one in the middle, you'll notice that dry pattern over northern Western Australia has decreased. It doesn't take up as much area. And you'll notice that in Queensland, it's almost some sort of different parts of Queensland that have that dry influence compared to where they were in December. On the right-hand side, there's a map there of the globe, and it's showing sea surface temperature forecasts for December. And what I'll draw your attention to is off northwestern Australia, you can see there's that large patch of cooler than usual water. And that partly is what's driving that dry outlook for northwestern WA in December. But what we see looking ahead through the season is that cooler water isn't expected to last all summer. And so the odds for drier than normal months start to wane as we're moving through the season for WA. Now, this next slide is giving us some guidance about stream flow over summer. Well, I beg your pardon, not exactly summer, it's showing you stream flow for November through to January. And so on the map of Australia, you can see a bunch of orange and blue dots, and they correspond to sites where we're measuring stream flow and where we're providing forecasts for what that stream flow is like in the 3 months ahead. And straight away, the thing that sort of stands out is that most of those sites are orange, which corresponds to low flow. And it's about 90% of sites on that map that are in that low flow category. And it's not until we start moving further up the east coast that we do see some sites where the blue colouring, we're near median flow. Now, some of the reasons why we have that dry, warm outlook we'll discuss. One big factor is what's happening out in the Pacific Ocean with ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And the Bureau has been at El Nino alert since September, and we estimate there's about a 70% chance of El Nino developing in the coming months.
Can I interrupt you for a couple of questions, Jonathan?
Yes, please.
Is it okay? We had a question from David. There were lots of blue-green colours last November and it didn't rain last summer. What makes us right this time?
Sorry?
I'm guessing at the start of the talk you were telling me that this time last year we were going into a La Nina, so there might have been
That's right.
more blue-green colours on our outlook.
Yes.
So David's asking, last year there was lots of blue-green last November and it didn't rain. What makes you right this time?
Well, I have to go back and have a look at what happened with the forecast to verify it. But no, we have confidence in the outlook for much of Australia, including including most of Queensland. Sorry, getting back to the drivers. So out in the Pacific, we've had this developing El Nino, and we're not quite there yet. There's a few things that are holding us back from declaring it as a full-blown event. So we'll look through at some of those criteria now.
All right, can I ask you a couple more questions?
Yeah.
We've had one from Phil. Obviously, temperature prediction is much improved accuracy in forecasting, but do we have to wait until about April for the world climatic patterns to reset before we can get a better forecasting accuracy?
Well, it depends which element we're talking about. For some of the elements, for things like seasonal rainfall, there can be a bit of a dip in our predictability around autumn. The outlook does perform differently for different parts of the country at different times of year, and there are some times of the year where the seasonal weather is more predictable compared to other times.
Thank you. Melanie's asked us about the projections for cyclones, but I think that's coming up later in your talk.
Yeah, we'll have a little look at the cyclone outlook in a few slides.
Cool. All right. If you can keep going through the El Nino outlook.
That's right. So we're on El Nino alert and have been for a couple of months now. And what we see in the sea surface temperature patterns of the Pacific is it looks quite El Nino-like. So what we look for is a pooling of warmer than usual water in the central Pacific, and that map of sea surface temperatures, you can kind of see that there is warming in the tropics or along the equator in the central Pacific, but there's also a lot of warming across the Pacific Ocean outside the tropics too.
And Jonathan, that's hit 0.8 as well, hasn't it? Our threshold for El Nino.
That's right. On the right-hand side, so across from the maps, you can see some bar charts. And what those charts show you is the model forecasts from a bunch of different models, not just the bureaus. The bureaus one is at the top there, but from a bunch of international agencies who produce forecasts for ENSO. And they're all in agreement that the sea surface temperatures out in the middle of the Pacific are at sort of above El Nino thresholds and are likely to stay that way for a couple of months in the months ahead.
Can I ask you a few more questions? I'm sorry, we've had a few on the outlook, even though we've moved on slightly. Let's go to a couple of questions. So Phil's asking us, most rainfall predictions in New South Wales are low accuracy. When does that change?
We don't have the maps handy, but we can have a look and get back to Phil afterwards.
Yeah, we do have the skill maps on the website for the outlooks, right?
That's right, yeah, there's skill maps on the website for every month and every season, and they can show you how the outlook has performed in the past for those regions at that time of year.
So that's how we can talk about our confidence for our outlooks, yeah?
That's right, yeah.
So for every 3-month chunk, there is a skill map for rainfall and both maximum and minimum temperature.
That's right,
yeah?
and monthly skill maps as well for the 1 month.
So that's probably something we can include in future talks, because we didn't put them on today, but they're definitely on the external website.
That's right, yeah.
So that's under the climate section?
That's right, just where you find the regular climate outlooks, you can also find the skill maps.
Fantastic, thank you. Peter's asking, why no data for February on temperature or rainfall? Is the northern wet likely to be more? Is the N wet likely for more in Feb-March? I think he's talking about the northern wet season, yeah?
I think there's 2 questions there.
Yeah.
The first one, so we produced the 1 month outlooks for the month coming up and the month following that, but not the 3rd month that is included in the seasonal outlook.
Yeah.
Because the skill falls away the further out we're looking for those 1 month.
We just want to show the ones that we have
That's
confidence
right.
in, yeah.
But the seasonal outlook, because it's an average for the 3 months, that still has skill, even though it's also looking through into February.
Thank you. Adrian's asking, what are the drivers for East Coast lows, which leads to rain in East Gippsland? Oh, that's a bit of a weather question, I think, not so much in the climate.
That's right, we might have to drag a meteorologist in here.
We'll have to, maybe we can get back to Adrian on that one later. Any other, can we go on with a couple more? Yeah? Nita's asking us, can you explain the upper atmosphere mixing anomalies which prevented rainfall during winter 2018? Whoa, that's a tricky one, Nita.
Yeah, the rainfall for 2018 is really interesting, the fact that it was so dry, yet for a lot of it we didn't have a strong push from our usual climate drivers. Well, what we're looking at now out in the Pacific is sort of an El Nino pattern, but for a lot of the year, even and when it was very dry, we didn't have an El Nino in place. We had sort of neutral conditions in the Pacific, and it wasn't really until spring that we started to get that positive IOD, which was probably giving us a drier influence as well over parts of southern Australia.
Thank you. Do you want to go on, or can you take a few more questions, because we're getting heaps?
It might be better to finish this segment, because it might answer a few questions that we're getting through.
About our El Nino outlook. Thank you. Well, let's go to the end of that and then take some more questions.
So just to recap, on this slide, we were looking at the sea surface temperature patterns out in the Pacific, and they indicate an El Nino at the moment. But on this next slide, we're going to have a look at, there's a few criteria we need for an El Nino event that we haven't quite met yet. So on the right-hand side is our handy table on how to spot an El Nino. And the first criteria relates to sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. And as we just saw, they're looking El Nino-like at the moment. So we've got a green tick there. The next criteria is surface pressure. And one of the ways, or the traditional way that we've measured that, is via the Southern Oscillation Index. And that's a measure of the differences in pressure between Darwin and Tahiti and compared to their usual difference. So the chart on the left-hand side is a plot of the monthly values of the Southern Oscillation Index since the start of the year. And now you can see that we did have values that were sort of in the El Nino range back in September, but since then the October value came in at about +3, and the November value has ended up coming in slap bang on about 0. So recently, the Southern Oscillation Index has been looking quite neutral, not El Nino-like at all. So we've got a red cross there against surface pressure. And if you want to see more details about the criteria for El Nino and for the outlook, there's a link there to the website, and that gives you a bit more detail about what specific indices and what values we're looking for these 4 criteria. So that was the pressure. Now the trade winds, typically during El Nino, we would expect trade winds to weaken or sometimes even reverse. And we haven't seen that happen consistently. There's been a few bursts of it being weaker than usual, and that's assisted in the warming. But it hasn't been the constant weaker trades that we would normally expect. To expand on that a little bit, I've got some schematics there on the left-hand side. And the very far left one is showing you what the trade wind pattern looks like in a neutral year. And you can see the trade winds blowing from east to west along the equator. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the changes we might expect to see during El Nino. And so on that right-hand image, you can see that the warmer water has moved out into the Central Pacific. We're getting sort of above normal convection happening out there. And we've got a weakening of the trade winds that are sort of pushing back against those westerly, those sort of anomalies in the Eastern Pacific. So it's not a cross or a tick for trade winds, but it's sort of a hand wavy or an orange wave, and we're waiting to see what happens there, whether or not that'll help reinforce the El Nino.
Kind of a C, right?
Yeah, that's right. Now, on this next slide, we're looking at a map of the outgoing long wave radiation, and that's a fancy proxy for cloudiness, if you like. So cloud patterns are one of the other things we look at when we're trying to decide whether or not what stage of the ENSO cycle we're in. And now, the map that you can see now is it's an old map. It's back from the summer of 2014, 2015. And that shows you the kind of cloud pattern we might expect during a classical El Nino. So those blue tones are regions where there's more cloud than usual, and the orange-brown tones are regions where there's less cloud than usual. And typically, during El Nino, we would expect to see more cloudiness around the date line in the Central Pacific and less cloudiness than usual north of Australia.
So this is a very typical pattern, right?
That's right. That's the typical pattern we would expect to see. Now I'm showing you a map from more recent months, and you can see it's quite different. There is a blob of blue there, sort of near the equator, but it's much further east than it typically would be.
That looks like it might even be a cyclone.
That's right. Well, we've had some cyclonic activity in that region, but the takeaway point is that we haven't got that sort of above average cloudiness out around the date line, which would be typical of El Nino. So for our cloud criteria, we've got a red cross there as well. So it's really only in the ocean so far that we've seen El Nino sort of developing. We haven't sort of seen a reaction from the atmosphere. And that's really what we're looking for in an El Nino event. We're looking for coupling between the ocean and the atmosphere. That'll give us a feedback loop and it'll keep the event lasting.
Thank you. Let's take some more questions before we go on to your severe weather outlooks. The question from David came in, how come the skill maps change a lot from month to month?
That's right. As we mentioned just before, at different times of the year, we have more or less predictability, and so that affects the skill of the outlook.
So do we have better times of year than others?
Generally, when we have our best skill is when we've got an ENSO phase, we can see it's going to sort of, when we've either got a La Nina or an El Nino developing, and we're fairly confident that's going to persist for months at a time. That's what gives us a lot of our seasonal predictability.
Thank you. David also says there has been recent discussions that there can be significant differences between the El Ninos. Any comments on whether this El Nino is good or bad or worse?
That's a great question, and I'm going to pinch that one. You're right that there are about 2/3 of El Ninos typically bring widespread dry conditions. Usually when we look at El Nino, it's over the winter to spring period, and that's when it affects Australia the most. We're getting later in the season now, and what happens during the summer months is the focus of the dry influence sort of draws up into northern Queensland, so our rainfall outlook actually isn't that far off what we'd typically expect during El Nino in summertime. But the other thing to keep in mind is that usually we would, in a breakdown of El Nino, what often happens is we get rainfall coming to us in autumn afterwards during its breakdown cycle.
Fingers crossed, eh? The next question is from Andrew. Given the drought conditions over most of the country, would it make it worse if you got to a point of declaring El Nino?
So given the answer we just gave, it probably wouldn't change conditions too much. Our outlook that Jonathan showed earlier already incorporates El Nino in it.
Thank you. Kelsey just said, so has El Nino being placed in winter spring been the biggest drivers drying out the northern Queensland?
Well, so we haven't had an El Nino this winter or spring. During winter and spring, and still today, that the Pacific is technically neutral, even though it's looking more El Nino-like.
So what made it dry?
Well, that's what's really interesting. We started out the year in a La Nina, and most of our big climate drivers were fairly neutral through winter. So a lot of that dryness is probably natural variability.
It's just a dry year.
That's right.
With a dose of the long-term warming trend, likely.
Yeah, and Catherine's got a really good point there. So not only was it a dry year, it's also been an incredibly hot year. And so those two factors coupled have made the drought more severe than it would have been if it hadn't have been so warm.
Thank you. Gareth says, sometimes regional weather institutions, WMO and NOAA, make an ENSO call that's different from BOM. Why the difference? Another good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. Often the differences are quite slight. Often different agencies have slightly different criteria. Some agencies just look at the sea surface temperature patterns. They don't necessarily consider what's happening in the atmosphere above.
And we do actually, at the Bureau, that is, we consult with WMO. So WMO is joint. The statements from WMO are a joint statement from the world institutions that are experts on ENSO.
And as you explained, we're waiting for the coupling, yeah?
That's right. That's what we haven't really seen is persistent sort of coupling in the atmosphere to the pattern that's happening in the ocean.
Thank you. Nita asked, why has there been so many dust storms this year in CW Central West, New South Wales? We have not experienced such conditions for years. Severity of wind speed at the surface.
That's right. One of the factors for dust storms is the wind, but the other part is also just the lack of rainfall. And the persistent lack of rainfall has meant drier than usual soils, which mean there's more dust available for a dust storm.
We've seen some whoppers and we've seen some videos. It's been pretty tough. Are you happy to go on with your talk, Jonathan? Let's cover some of the severe weather impacts we're concerned about this summer.
That's right. So we've seen that it's likely to be a warm summer in most parts, and it's likely to be drier than usual in the north. And now let's have a look at how that translates to some impacts. So the bushfire outlook has been available for a while, and there was an update distributed in November. And that map on the left-hand side shows you areas of Australia that have sort of an above normal fire potential this summer. And you can see that includes a lot of the southeast along the coast and some of those same parts that have had a lot of below average rainfall. There were some notes attached with the November outlook that mentioned that even though there has been some recent rainfall in those parts of southeastern Australia, with the warm outlook, it's likely that any of those areas that have sort of benefited from recent rainfall, it wouldn't take long for them to dry out again. So that's why there hasn't been a big change in the bushfire outlook pattern between September and November releases.
The other thing to bear in mind with the inland areas is that a lot of the time it's low fuel loads. So the next type of severe weather we'll look at are heat waves. And so with the outlook for warmer than normal conditions, heat waves, surprisingly, are more likely. On the left-hand side are a couple of maps. So I was just going to draw you to our heat wave service. It's been operating for a little while now. There's two parts to it. The first part is an assessment or a monitoring tool, which tells you if the temperatures we've had recently qualify as a heat wave. And I put these maps on yesterday, and they show you that earlier in the week, we did in fact have heat wave conditions over much of northern Australia. Now the second part, and this is perhaps more exciting, more useful, is we also have a forecast service. So that can show you the areas that are likely to have a heat wave in the coming days. And so there's an example there from this week again, in the bottom left, showing you that much of Western Australia has the potential for an extreme heat wave in the coming days ahead. So there's four categories there on the heat wave maps. The first one, the no heat wave, is fairly straightforward. The next one, the beige colouring for low intensity heat wave. These are the most common types of heat waves, and these are heat waves that you're going to notice, and you'll probably feel it. You'll probably read it being reported about, but they don't have as much impact as the next couple of criteria. The next one being severe heat waves, where people who are vulnerable, so perhaps the elderly or the young, we need to look out for them because they can face challenges.
And the fourth category is the most extreme. That's extreme heat wave, and that's the ones we have the least of, but ones where even healthy people need to pay attention of the conditions around them. Now, the other thing that ENSO impacts is tropical cyclones over the Australian region. And typically, when we have El Niño, we see fewer than average cyclones. So this map on the left-hand side comes from our tropical cyclone outlook, and it gives you some guidance on the likely numbers of cyclones we'll see in the Australian region, but also in the east, north, northwestern and western areas of the country coming up.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's been a great presentation. We've had some questions come through the Q&A function from Annika. Can we know when the special climate statement will be released more specifically?
When I asked yesterday, they only told me early next week. Part of the reason is because they just need to check the numbers and check that all the facts are correct.
Good. It takes a little bit of time, these things. We'll get them out as fast as we can. From Keith, with an average forecast for rain on the east coast, in brackets Sydney, how does this work in with an El Niño?
So
Catherine's saying, me, let me do that.
So as mentioned before, because this event is so late in the year, if it develops, it doesn't really have much of an influence in that part of the country.
When we think El Niño, often we do think drought, but that's really only typical of events that happen during winter and spring, and that's when we get the widespread, drier than usual effects across eastern Australia. By the time they get to summer, those effects generally contract to northern Queensland. So that's why we can have a likely El Niño in the Pacific and a neutral outlook for parts of southeastern Australia this summer.
Thank you.
And that forecast that we have that we were showing does incorporate El Niño in it. So we wouldn't expect anything to change in terms of our forecast, if we declared El Niño.
Thank you. One more on El Niño. We've had a few cyclone questions too. Blake asked us, should El Niño be confirmed during summer? Would it be likely that this event would persist through Southern Hemisphere winter and spring in 2019? There's another good question.
That's actually a really good question. And usually what happens is that El Niño events, due to the seasonal cycle, they sort of voluntarily decline in autumn. It's just the way that things move, the winds and such move in the tropical Pacific. But the weird thing is that our sea surface temperature forecasts are actually persisting the heat through. So we're not really sure what the forecast models are seeing, but usually if an event starts, it would typically end in autumn.
Thank you. Matt's asked us, what are these likelihoods relative to?
So the likelihoods on the outlooks, the probabilities for temperature and rainfall?
Mm-hmm. We think so, yes. Matt, if you had something else to tell us through the chat function, please. But yes, let's answer it from that version.
Well, that's the probability or the chance you have of getting more rainfall than usual, more rainfall than you typically would in summer.
Okay, thank you. Now on to cyclones. Stephen's asked, with the 40% chance of tropical cyclones this season, do you think there could be embedded vortex within these cyclones? Wow, there's a good question. For example, TC Debbie had confirmed one. Well, I think we've got a cyclone expert online with us.
The tropical cyclone outlook really just tells us about the number of likely cyclones in the region, doesn't really tell us about their size or structure or even the path they might take.
Thank you. Peter asked, is there also a prediction of number of cyclones making landfall?
No, and that's important. So that's just the expected numbers for cyclones in those areas. Yeah, it doesn't tell you how many might make landfall, and in the same way, it doesn't tell you what the the tracks for those are, whether or not they're likely to hit populated areas or unpopulated areas. It's really just giving you some guidance about the numbers of cyclones you might have across the entire season.
But our stats show us we've always had one make landfall every season, right?
That's right. Even in seasons where we've had particularly low numbers, at least one of those has crossed the coast.
Fantastic. Matt's come back to us about that likelihood question. He said he was talking about those tables before with bushfires, floods, etc.
I don't know about the bushfire one because that's done by the Bushfire National Hazard CRC, but it says above normal bushfire potential, so they'll have some baseline that they're looking at there.
I'm guessing
So
it's our red and green arrows, yeah? On those diagrams?
And the historic trends for those indices during different phases of ENSO. So typically in the past, when we've had El Nino, we have seen more bushfire weather.
A few things go into those arrows, eh? And we just try and summarise it as an arrow. Rachel said, thanks, this was all really useful, so that's really good. We've only got about 10 minutes left, so if you have any other questions for us, please make sure that you send it through the chat function. Catherine has a question.
No, it's actually, I wanted to add something to that bushfire thing. The other thing to bear in mind is that southeastern Australia is one of the most bushfire-prone areas in the world, and there usually is some bushfire activity, so average doesn't necessarily mean no bushfire.
The risk is still there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tom's asking us, will it be windy? Another good question. What do we know about wind?
I wish we had that in our forecasts. It's one of those ones that we'd like to in the coming years, though.
Yeah, we haven't done the climatological stats on that one yet.
No, we don't have a public wind forecast yet.
Okay. From a seasonal point of view. Okay, thank you. From Esteban, hi, for the heatwave forecast, is the humidity taken into account or is it only just temperature? Thanks.
Oh, Esteban.
Yeah, no, the heatwave forecast does take into account humidity. The formula is a little bit complicated. It looks at the forecast temperature and it compares it to recent temperatures and also what the climatological average is for that time of year as well.
Thank you. Dr. Andrew Watkins has pitched into our discussion. He's a mad keen windsurfer and he's telling us typically more sea breezes in an El Nino. So that's a good news for the summer windsurfers out there.
Thanks, Boss.
Dave says, I've noticed that the BOM has started using Tableau for data visualisation in the storages section. Are there any plans to use this in other areas where data is? We're all looking a bit blank at that one. We might have to get back to you on that one. That one's probably more a question for our water section. Andrew's telling us again, but inland it tends to be lower wind speeds. Thanks, Andrew. Peter said, I would be interested in seeing a wind forecast available in the future, so maybe that's something we can add to the job list. David's asking us, do you do seasonal cloud cover? I own a commercial solar farm in Western New South Wales and need to predict future incomes.
So we don't have an outlook for outgoing long wave radiation or cloudiness, but we do have that rainfall outlook. And typically, when we have above average rainfall, we have above average cloud, and in a drier season, we'd have less cloud than usual.
Thank you, and it probably relates to the temperature forecast, maybe not.
Well, rainfall can impact the temperature forecast, but it is complicated. It sort of changes depending on where you are in Australia.
Cool, thank you. Kelsey says, leading back to neutral climate drivers for a little bit across the board, how often does this occur? And when drivers are going to neutral phases, does this indicate less rainfall?
Typically, when our drivers are neutral, we have average conditions, or we're not getting a strong push towards wetter or drier conditions in the season ahead.
Thank you. Kelsey says, trying to understand why New South Wales dried out in August and the correlation to this for future climate and longer bushfire seasons. Good question, Kelsey. Any comments?
I think they're still trying to suss out a bit what happened in winter. I don't have numbers at hand, but I think the the ridge might have been, the subtropical ridge might have been quite high, but it was a bit puzzling as to why exactly it was so dry. But there was, I believe there was increased wind, and the temperatures would have been a factor too.
Thank you. We might go to our summary for the talk now. We've only got 5 minutes to go. We've done most of our questions. We'll do our summary and we'll even stay online if there's a few more questions that we need to answer. We'll see how we go. So, Catherine, yeah?
So, summer 2018, it looks as though it's going to be drier for much of the north, warmer than usual days and nights, and high chances of that for most of the country. We still have the El Nino alert in place. We think there's about a 70% chance El Nino will occur in the coming months. With the warm and dry outlook, we've got an increased chance of bushfires, heat waves and drought, but we have a decreased chance of widespread flooding and tropical cyclones. Now, most of the material that we talked about today comes from a few products that you can go and have a look at or play with yourself. There's the Climate Outlooks, which gives us the monthly and seasonal guidance for temperature and rainfall. There's a great Outlook video which provides a summary of the Outlook and the influences behind it. The ENSO wrap-up is the place to go if you're curious about what's happening in the Pacific Ocean at the moment. And if you want to get reminders for any of these products, there's a link there to subscribe to our e-alerts.
So that brings us to the end of our webinar today. Our next Outlook webinar for autumn will be on Thursday the 7th of March, so don't forget to register. A very big thank you to Catherine and Jonathan for your time in developing the content and sharing your wisdom with us today. Also for Fatima for being with us. And great job, Caroline, as producer. To our audience, thank you for tuning in and joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the session and we do hope you'll join us again next time. If you would like to continue the conversation, please use the hashtag #BOMWebinars in your LinkedIn posts. As mentioned earlier, this session has been recorded and we will have the video ready for your on-demand viewing pleasure in the next few days, so watch this space. Finally, but more importantly, we want your feedback. We're getting a few thanks very much from everyone, and particularly from Gareth. He said, "Thanks all, please have a safe and Merry Christmas. Having worked on climate risks around the world, I'm truly thankful for the highest quality work of the BOM." So yay, thank you Gareth, that's really helpful. It's our aim to bring you the highest possible quality webinars, but we can't do that unless you share our experiences with us, your experiences. Once we close this webinar, a short survey will pop up on your screen and we'd be very grateful for you to complete it for us anonymously. So once again, thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you again soon, and goodbye. Caroline, will we take a few more questions or keep recording? No, thank you. Thank you for your questions. We had an email there. You can send them to us later. Otherwise, we will close the session. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.